So, John Wood Jr., man, I am excited to have this conversation with you. It has been a short period of time in which I've come to discover you, but in this time period, man, you've been a breath of fresh air. In some ways, a canary in a coal mine for me. And I just felt like it is imperative for me to have a conversation with you, so not only that I can learn, but so that I can get some of the folks who follow me to expand their understanding not only just of politics but of faith and justice. And so, thank you for joining me, brother.
Oh man, it's an honor to be invited and to be in your presence. I'll be it digitally.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, the pleasure is mine.
All right, so one, I want you to kind of tell me who you are, for those folks who don't know you, but also want you to explain, like, what is Braver Angels, what is your role with Braver Angels, and why is their work so important?
John Wood Jr., I'm a national ambassador with an organization called Braver Angels. It was originally called Better Angels, quote from Abraham Lincoln, reference to the better angels of our nature, right? We are now Braver Angels. It's the largest grassroots bipartisan organization in the country, focused in on what you might refer to as political depolarization, but really what it is working across the partisan divide in order to restore a sense of community, and I would argue mutual dignity and collaboration to our politics, left, right, and center. And within that, we deal with a number of different issues, not including but not limited to matters of race, identity, and even faith and religious divides as well. We have debate programs that give people the opportunity to challenge each other on their positions on important issues, but in a context that's meant to uplift humility, intellectual honesty, not about owning or destroying the other person, but actually getting a window into who they are and why they think the way that they do, hearing from people's convictions. I guess I'll say a little bit about my background. Before Braver Angels, I was a nominee for Congress. I ran for Congress I ran for Congress in 2014 in Los Angeles.
As a Republican, huh? A black man running Congress as a Republican. I'm sure that didn't go too well in Los Angeles.
Well, it was worse than that because I was running against Maxine Waters.
Yeah, and I figured that too, and that's
more intense. But actually, funny thing, people frequently come up to me and ask. They say, "Oh man, what was it like being called an Uncle Tom and having people dump on you and so forth?" Yeah, I won't say that I didn't get any of that, and I've got a story or two that I think you'll find interesting if you want me to share. But for the most part, I didn't get the kind of hate that you would typically expect, maybe. Black Republican running against someone like that in the black community to get. And I think it's just because I didn't lead with party politics exactly. I led with just sort of who I am as a family man, as a member of the community, as a Christian, as a black person, but also as somebody who's trying to bring out the best in everybody and somebody who wanted to talk about ideas. Story people would say, what at the age of 26 makes you qualified to represent a district like ours? And that was true whether I was speaking to black Democrats in South LA or to a white Tea Party group in sort of South Bay LA County, which is a part of the district. And I'd say, well, interesting family background. Mom is a liberal black Democrat from inner city LA. Dad is a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. Grew up explaining my mother to my father to my mother. And that's why I think I can relate to all of you. And it always got a laugh, but it was, roughly described the nature of my upbringing. All of that goes into making me. Yeah. And so, I don't shy away from that. And I also don't shy away from both what that shows me and how maybe that limits me in understanding certain things.
You showed up as yourself in a podcast, and that podcast caught my attention. And one of the things I noticed was that you were alongside other deep thinking African Americans who don't fit neatly into a particular political party. We know that parties are necessary to get things done. However, you got to speak truth to both sides, as you've communicated when being a mediator and arbitrator, even in your own home with your mother and your father.
Right.
What are some of the tensions that you feel today as you're trying to be that mediator in culture?
People want you to share their certainty. Mm-hmm. They want you to share their partisan convictions. You can say. A lot of times people will look maybe at somebody who's kind of trying to hold the space for a degree of nuance or doubt or flexibility in between the established kind of positions on our in our politics, and folks will have the sense that there's no way that can be a sincere stance because the moral differentials between the
Right.
different sides are just that clear.
Right.
And the way I deal with that is through, I think, establishing kind of an expectation that when you speak with me, you're speaking to somebody who has the courage of his convictions. But my convictions lean less on my opinions on policies and more on the one thing I am certain about, which is that ultimately the progress of human society, whether we're talking about economics, political science, or justice and social justice, is tied to the character of who we are as people. And that's demonstrated not so much in what we believe about criminal justice reform per se, or what we believe about economics or immigration per se, but on whether or not we have the courage to be honest, whether or not we have the gentleness to be compassionate, whether or not we have the capacity to be empathetic, whether or not we have the patience to be receptive to wisdom, whether or not we have the endurance to be hopeful, and whether or not we have the insight to live by faith, and ultimately, the capacity to be guided by love in everything that we do, to the extent that we can summon that type of bearing, to the extent to which we can be Christ-like. And I would put that forward, even for somebody who wasn't a Christian, as just kind of the ultimate sort of archetype of what a righteous human being is.
At what point is civility not an option anymore? At what point, and I know you have some opinions about cancel culture, at what point should we cancel, if we should cancel anybody at all or ever?
I'm oftentimes associated with civility work and so forth, and civility is not a bad thing, but I rarely use the term to describe what I do, because I look at civility as being something of a thermostat, if you will. When civility declines between people, it's evidence of the fact that deeper human connections are being split, right? Civility can definitely be performative. You can imitate politeness, but if there's not genuine empathy and respect underneath that civility is never going to last. And so I'm not about repairing civility so much as I am about reestablishing goodwill. That's the foundation for civility. It's more important than that, We've got to mean well towards each other before we can have a society in which anybody bothers to be polite. So I just want to put that out there.
That's a good.
But when do I cease to be civil? Look, so actually that sort of leads into the answer to the question. I never cease to have goodwill. Or at least if I do, it means if I do cease, I'm off track spiritually. You can curse at me, you can chew me out, you can say something that's blatantly racist, blatantly offensive, blatantly condemnatory, whatever the case may be. I will seek to return fire with love, with goodwill. That doesn't mean affection. That doesn't even necessarily mean that I'm going to hold to every modicum of courtesy.
Yes.
I can raise my voice. I can exude power. I can say what you've just said, in my opinion, is deeply ignorant. My hope, though, as a societal matter, would be that we could advocate for these sorts of changes, and that we can advocate for whatever position we're taking in a way that doesn't foreclose the larger sort of need for there to be a pathway towards redemption, towards a person being able to sort of reestablish who they are and to learn from their mistakes so that they can create a constructive future for themselves as a part of the community. Because ultimately, in seeking to build a community, at least if you adopt the nonviolent perspective, what you're trying to accomplish is a context in which people can make mistakes but still remain within the embrace, within the family circle of the society that they share.
Yeah. How has faith been something that is quite important to you, and how, and not just in our personal lives, but in the greater narrative of this country?
Right. Yeah. Man, that's a deep question. I guess the deepest answer and the most personal answer I can give you to faith's importance for me, and I think possibly for broader society as well, is that faith supplies this, what you could call sort of a priori conviction. A priori meaning sort of like before anything else, right? For me, in looking at the world through the lens of faith and my place in it, I kind of enter into our social and political disputes and questions with a conviction that says that God has already won, because the world that God is building, the world that is beyond the world, the kingdom, if you will, that already exists. And what it is that I'm living through, what it is that I'm participating in, is really just sort of a piece of the puzzle in terms of getting there in some sense, And I can't see the end. I see through a mirror dimly, right?
Right.
But what I know is that if I'm walking in the Spirit and I see the spark of divinity in you and Republicans and Democrats, black folks, white folks, so on and so forth, if suddenly I become highly attuned and sensitive to everything that is best in all the people around me, and I operate on a wavelength to where I'm speaking to that consistently, then suddenly that actually becomes the reality that I live in, right? I mean, it's a funny thing. People will say that, somebody will say so-and-so is an asshole, or so-and-so is a great guy. And if I hear two different people describe Sho Baraka these two different ways, I might think to myself, well, the truth is probably both. Sho probably got a couple different sides to himself.
Oh, no, I'm definitely an asshole.
Probably just likewise. So, it just depends on, well, what moment did you catch him?
Right,
And,
exactly.
what side of yourself did you
We're
show?
complex people. We're very complex people.
Right, but faith gives me a little bit of a blueprint in which the suffering of the past is, in a sense, redeemed by the promise of the future, because ultimately I operate from a psychological position that says, well, we're here for a reason, and that reason is fully fleshed out in the glory that God has in store for us, but we have to transcend our own kind of fallen natures to rise up to that, right? To make it on earth as it is in heaven, to do that as much as we can do in our lifetimes, and to continue the journey after we've left our bodies.
Yeah.
And so it gives me this deep confidence. And I think that confidence that it gives a person is indispensable ultimately to the forward motion of humanity, right? And to all of our particular individual struggles. And so when Dr. King talked about the beloved community, when he talked about the promised land, I mean, he wasn't speaking he was obviously, a social and political activist, but he wasn't speaking in primarily sociological or political terms. And even when he was, right, but the substrate of that, the architecture within which he spoke politically was ultimately sort of metaphysical and theological.
Definitely.
The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. King operated with the conviction that there is a forward motion kind of built into the nature of things by which we evolve in a godly direction.
How can art be useful in a moment like this? Why is art necessary? How does it heal a broken world?
I think that music has the capacity to do several things that can't be done in any other way, in a way that is scalable to people who, otherwise have nothing in common. And that's on one hand providing a window into the soul and into the experience of people. When Billie Holiday sings Strange Fruit or something like that, I mean, you can read in a history book about lynchings, you can read about tragedy, so on and so forth. But when you hear it resonating up in song, a person who has no biographical connection whatsoever to the subject can feel the spirit of what's being expressed and be transformed in a way that it allows you to become one with the pain of somebody else or the hope of somebody else, right? In a way that's not necessarily the case otherwise. And, powerful music can solidify a culture of change. It can solidify a culture of progress that gives us something to do, that binds us together in our day-to-day lives, but also allows us to imagine what a better future might look like going forward. And so, yeah, I mean, we're not purely like intellectual creatures as human beings. We're not even primarily that.
Yeah.
Spiritual beings, we're emotional beings. We've got other senses by which we have to communicate with each other. And so, you're saying a change is going to come and whatnot. You get a sense of the deep loss, but also the optimism that endures through struggle. But that's given voice literally by someone like Sam Cooke, who can marshal that outward in tones of glory, if you will.
Beautiful.
There's no way you can do that in just a regular speech, and I give a lot of speeches. I mean, oratory has its power for sure.
Right.
The music is indispensable.
Yeah, it reshapes imagination. What excites you first about a Joe Biden presidency, and then what concerns do you have about a Joe Biden presidency?
Okay, yeah. So let me say that I think that Joe Biden is a person who really has an honest desire to bring people together. I mean, I get that from Biden. I picked that up, I mean, without any commentary on his policies or any of his missteps or any of the things he may have done or not have done in the past, I think as a human being, he's like that. And I think he wants to be a president for all Americans, which is exactly what a president should strive to be. I mean, I'm a registered Republican, but I think we've been missing that for the last few years. I guess what concerns me, though, is that I think that the United States needs a deep reckoning in this country with the lived experiences of people across the cultural and political spectrum in a way that allows us to surface our grievances, our misgivings, our frustrations in a manner that may bring conflict and tension, but that is not ultimately destructive. I mean, obviously there's so much to be said for the Black experience, the pain of the Black experience, and other marginalized groups and people of color, et cetera. And that needs to be amplified, and that's being amplified. And it's vital for that to be the case in order for there to be healing and progress. But we do live, in my estimation, in a fallen world where pain and suffering, guilt and struggle is a property of the human condition across colors and categories. White folks have experienced plenty of pain in America too. And even if you believe in sort of a sociological framework in which the United States of America is essentially something that has evolved according to a white supremacist kind of formula, it nevertheless remains the case that in a country of 330 million odd people, you have 330 million histories in which there's plenty of room for folks of all kinds, including white folks, including folks in the Rust Belt, including, folks in the South, et cetera, to have deep experiences of loss and pain and struggle, which, maybe there's some way in which we bring these things on ourselves. There's always an element of truth to that for Black people too. Without drawing any false equivalencies. But there's also deep stories of suffering and pain that need healing and reconciliation themselves before people come to the point of optimally being able to listen to each other and work for change, right? And so my concern is that the politics of the next several years might continue to devolve in the direction that they sort of have been devolving, where folks see political progress or the idea of political progress as being more equated to simply our ability to grab hold of the levers of power and exercise that power than it really is. Democracy needs to be about including all voices in a way to where power is shared and allows us to enjoy progress together. So I'm not at all opposed to the idea that we should seek power. But ultimately, power, as Dr. King said, without love becomes authoritarian and brutal. It's possible for you to win an election and to lose the long-term ability to actually generate a better future for you and for your people. right?
You're talking
Because if you seize power on the foundation of enmity, then the outcome of that is the continuing decline of our institutions. The outcome of that is ultimately civil war. You know, it's ultimately a state in which nobody sees anything good or redemptive in the other side. And therefore, everything we do in politics and society is meant to undercut the advantages of the other person. And in that context, you know, the victors become the king of the ashes, if you will.
Yeah.
You know, and so, you know, again, it's about walking that line, speaking truth, but doing so in a spirit of love, pushing your position, but making space for reconciliation. And if you can't do both, there's really no future worth fighting for.
I can already see that some people watching this will say, well, what I hear from you, John, is that people on the margins will continue to have to be the wood that burns, that cooks the melting pot of America. And that's quite unfair. But I feel that you don't really think that, and that you have a differing view.
That's something that, you know, I hear a lot, and I understand the point. But it was a point that was raised in Dr. King's time too. And look, I'm sort of unapologetically Kingian. And but the thing about love as a social value and sort of what nonviolence teaches. Nonviolence does teach you to pick up the cross, right? It teaches you going in that the struggle is not going to be a fair one, you know? But the thing that's empowering about love and goodwill as a social force is, well, two things. One, it allows you to speak as much as may be possible to the humanity in the opposition, because most people who are racist or bigoted or otherwise corrupted are people who, in the nonviolent way, and I think in the Christian way of understanding things, they're folks who have a certain spirit, if you will, acting upon them. We are victims of a sickness that we might call ignorance, but it's not everything that defines a person's humanity. Love allows you to speak to the conscience of the person who may be afflicted with a certain ignorance or hatred or whatever it may be, in a way that makes it more likely that you'll reach that person and change him. And even if you fail to do so, love still allows you to alleviate from yourself the albatross of hatred or fear or judgmentalism in a way that makes it easier for you to operate day to day.
And dare I ask you, is this somewhat of a very subtle castigation of anti-racism?
I've written about the ideology of anti-racism, the philosophy of nonviolence in contrast with each other, and you can look up an essay called "Reclaiming Nonviolence in the Age of Anti-Racism," or maybe I titled it "In the Era of Anti-Racism." There's a shorter version of that same essay entitled "Remember Martin Luther King," which appeared on Persuasion magazine. But basically, yes, it is at the heart of my concern with anti-racism that in certain versions of anti-racism anyway, there is very little emphasis on, if not an outright rejection of, the idea that certain individuals or certain groups of people are ultimately redeemable and changeable, because it tends to talk about the psychological condition of racism as being something that is so fixed and ingrained that we ought not meaningfully operate on the supposition that human transformation can take place. Right. And yet, on the other hand, it wouldn't be much reason for there to be an anti-racist project if it weren't the case that people could come around to a different way of being. Yeah. But I just want to be clear really quick. I try not to simplify anti-racism, because there are different versions of the idea out there. Yeah. Some people in the anti-racist movement, I think, are seeing more and more the need to recapture what nonviolence really elevated. Yeah. And that's love as a transformational power.
That's brilliant, bro. That's good. Well, brother, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. You are, I think you're a gem for the culture right now. I think you are a necessary voice. But thank you for joining us and having this conversation.
God bless you, show. The feeling is mutual. Looking forward to next time.
All right, man. Appreciate you.